Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diane Hoffman, and for those of you who don't know me, I am on the faculty at the University of Maryland Law School, where I direct the Law and Healthcare program. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the third in our 2022-2023 Rothenberg Healthcare Law and Policy Speaker Series. And I want to welcome all of you, those of you who were returned and those of you who are here for the first time. The series was established with funding from the Karen Rothenberg and Jeffrey Seltzer Law and Healthcare Program Endowment, and it focuses on contemporary issues in healthcare law and policy. Professor Rothenberg was a former dean of the law school and founder and director of our law and healthcare program. And this is the third year we've been doing this series. We started it during the pandemic, and the past year's themes have included health inequities exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, genetics, and justice in health law. This year, the speaker series has had a special focus on reproductive health topics in light of the Supreme Court's decision in June of 2022 on Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. Our first speaker in the series was Professor Kimberly Mutcherson from Rutgers University Law School, who spoke on A Phoenix from the Ashes, Reproductive Justice in a World Without Roe. And then in November, Professor Elizabeth Sepper from the University of Texas at Austin School of Law spoke on religious liberty and reproduction. And of course, today we have Professor Michelle Oberman from Santa Clara University School of Law, who will discuss doctors' risks, rights, and ethical obligations when providing abortion information. And we also have one more speaker this session who I'll announce at the end of the event. But to formally introduce Professor Oberman and moderate the session, I'm going to turn the Zoom microphone, so to speak, over to one of my newest colleagues and members of our faculty here at Maryland School of Law, Professor Lisa Vertinsky. She joined us last fall and is a nationally recognized health and intellectual property lawyer and economist who writes at the intersection of law, economics, and the regulation of healthcare markets and emerging technologies. And she is amazing. And so Lisa, take it away.
Thanks. I'm thrilled that we all get the opportunity to delve into Professor Oberman's work. Just to give you a little background, although I don't think she needs introduction, I think we all know of her great work. Professor Oberman is an internationally recognized scholar on a huge range of legal and ethical issues that arise at the intersection of sex, pregnancy, motherhood, and criminal law. And this paper really kind of canvasses a lot of that. For the past decade, she studied the impact of abortion regulation in countries with widely divergent abortion laws. Her work in El Salvador, along with other countries in a range of U.S. jurisdictions, informs her 2018 book, which I highly recommend, Her Body, Our Laws on the Front Lines of the Abortion War from El Salvador to Oklahoma. And her current work focuses on what changes on the ground when U.S. abortion law changes on the books. And that's what really we're going to be delving into today. If you have questions as you're coming along, if you could just type them in the chat, and then after we've had a chance to hear from Professor Oberman, then I'll be monitoring the chat and I'll be sure to turn to those. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Oberman.
Oh, thanks so much, Lisa. Thanks to the amazing team of health law folks at Maryland, Karen Rothenberg, who and Diane Hoffman, both of whom I met when I was just a baby law professor, and really have learned from so much over the years. Thanks also to Lisa, to Rebecca Hall, to Jihan Gerges. Nice to meet you. Here's my plan. I first want to start by thanking you for being here. I think that, months into this new landscape, it takes a special sort of stamina to want to show up and hear more about abortion. So it's heartening to see so many people on the call. My plan is to spend the next 35 minutes or so sketching out my current research study on how the abortion ban reshaped the care provided by clinicians in a state with a new abortion ban. And then to speak at some length about abortion information, why it matters, and why I believe that doctors are duty bound to share abortion information. And then we'll talk a little bit about the legal risks they face for doing so and assess whether they alter that ethical duty. I'm really curious to see what interests you. This is the first time I've actually talked about this work in public, so I'm hoping to leave time for questions and answers. Ample time, but if you find that you didn't get to answer your question, I'm very easy to find on the internet. There's not very many other Michelle Obermans, so please just email me. At some point, I can also stick my email in the chat and just let me know what you're thinking. So as a lawyer, as Lisa said, I've long been interested in the gap between law on the books and law on the ground. And I'm starting with this first slide here of, it's a Center on Reproductive Rights. Oh, sorry about that. So yeah, first slide, Center on Reproductive Rights, old map of the world as we knew it prior to Dobbs. The way that they had sorted the map was green countries where abortion was legal upon request, yellow countries where it was illegal without some sort of permission from the government, and then red countries where the procedure was completely banned. I started in 2008, and I went to Chile, which is dark red, meaning that it had a complete ban, including for life-saving abortions for pregnancies that were a threat to maternal life. And I went there expecting to find what I think our set point was when we thought about illegal abortion in 2008, which is women in the hospital dying of perforations to the uterus, right? All of the negative health consequences of illegal abortion. And I began then as now by talking to doctors who literally within seconds of my first interviews opened up really heavy desktop computers and showed me how with a few clicks they could go on to the Alameda, the main street in Santiago, and buy abortion medicines from guys in backpacks. So I came home puzzled by like, okay, well, here we are fighting over the need to ban abortion, whether abortion should be legal, and yet it's really quite accessible and women weren't dying. That actually led to around 10 years of work on and off in El Salvador, where similarly it'd be dark red, no exceptions, and yet 1 in 3 pregnancies end in abortion. So I learned there how abortion bans work in practice. I learned that safe access to abortion turns on access to pills and access to information about how to use them. So next slide. So here's a map, at least as of a week or so ago. I knew intellectually what would happen when Dobbs came down, when Roe was reversed. I knew that abortions would continue. I knew that the impact on access would be felt by the most vulnerable, those who needed to and struggled to access both the pills and or travel, but also the information that they would need to use them. And I knew it in a visceral sense that makes it hard for me to maintain a calm, objective academic tone when talking about the subject. I mean, normally I teach at a Catholic school, and I'm used to being in audiences and in beloved community with folks that see the issue differently. But on the ground in El Salvador, I learned that the most vulnerable there were teenagers who make up the largest percentage of maternal mortality in response to their abortion ban. 3 in 8 deaths to pregnant women in El Salvador are teenagers killing themselves. So at that very visceral level, I felt this sense of urgency about how we in this country will ensure that pattern isn't preceded, that the folks who need information get the information they need. I knew from my work there that doctors would be on the front lines in the response to the ban, that the easiest way to understand how bans are working would be to start by talking to doctors, because the state must enlist doctors in law enforcement efforts using the threat of prosecution to limit the care they provide, to limit also how they counsel their pregnant patients, and even to encourage them to violate confidentiality by reporting their patients to police. So I wanted to know how U.S. doctors would respond to the advent of abortion bans. Next slide. So with a new friend and colleague, Dr. Lisa Lehman, who's a professor at Harvard Medical School with both an MD and a PhD in ethics, I designed a research study that took me in July, literally the first week, within a week of the ban, to a state with a ban. Abortion is illegal outside of a very narrow exception for what they call life-threatening medical emergencies. I chose the location based on the fact that it had very high quality healthcare, like world-renowned institutions, a super conservative state legislature with a strong commitment, an activist commitment to abolishing abortion. I also chose it because it has entrenched racism and poverty, which I knew would drive abortion demand, because there's an insufficient social safety net and a certain blindness that comes with racism to the impact of the ban on the most marginalized populations. And I also chose it because it has nearby states where abortion is legal. So the process of finding doctors willing to talk to us was an arduous one. In order to protect the participants, I obtained an NIH certificate of confidentiality, which would protect the findings from discovery or any use against them. I designed a fully anonymized protocol, which is why I'm talking about a mid-sized city, meaning 2.5, 3 million people, but I'm not disclosing the city or the state. And I was able to interview 25 clinicians across a range of practice areas that I knew ahead of time would be impacted: addiction medicine, adolescent medicine, emergency medicine, reproductive endocrinology, and of course, maternal fetal medicine and obstetrics. I also wanted some ethicists and some psychiatrists, but wasn't as successful, and also oncologists. Just I think there were folks that in early July didn't understand themselves as being impacted. I also chose a diversity of practice settings, so academic centers, private practice, religious hospitals. All of the providers that I interviewed routinely encountered pregnant patients or patients who needed care related to pregnancy termination, but only 2 of the participants had worked specifically in the past as abortion providers. It was super hard to find doctors willing to talk to me. Most of them felt like they were taking a risk by speaking about abortion care, even off the record, even completely anonymized. I taped and then transcribed and deleted the tapes. But luckily, the referral networks developed over the course of a long career worked. And in the end, I was able to get a really wonderfully diverse pool, ethnicities, race, class backgrounds, locations, rural, urban, and religions. There was one voice missing from the pool, though. In spite of very intense effort, I couldn't find a single self-identified pro-life clinician willing to meet with me. The doctors that we interviewed opposed the abortion ban and thought it should be legal to end an unwanted pregnancy. These were not conscientious objectors to abortion-related care. In the end, that helped because it provides, I think, an important window into the ways in which abortion bans can impact the clinical care provided by those who believe their patients should be able to choose to end a pregnancy. So next slide. It quickly emerged that what was driving our participants' concern, and some intense concern, were the risks of running afoul of the ban, and that they described the impact of the ban on their care, both in the sorts of ways that make national headlines, cases involving miscarriage management, say, but also in a way that doesn't make the headlines, or at least hasn't so far, which is this more insidious silencing. The abortion ban was changing how the doctors talked to their patients about their options. It had altered the scope of the health information that doctors were willing to share with their patients who wanted or needed an abortion. Next slide. So informed consent has been a pretty fraught territory in the abortion war long before the abortion ban. This is the state that I was in, that had passed a law that required doctors to share what they called informed consent with their patients. That sort of informed consent contained pretty unfounded, you might say, assertions of fact. What's interesting on this slide, besides it having too much text, I'm sorry, is what the doctor does when handing over the text that the doctor believes contains false information. The doctor steps in to ensure that the doctor is a trusted health intermediary, protecting the patient's best interests by making sure they're not misled and providing accurate abortion information. So, and this was a pattern that a number of the doctors that I interviewed talked about, like just stepping in to make sure that they understand, that the patient understands what they need to understand as factual or scientifically trustworthy information. Next slide. So the abortion ban complicated that role of trusted intermediary, and it increased the amount of information and the complexity of information that the doctors felt their patients needed in order to make an informed choice about what their options were in response to an unwanted pregnancy. Some of the doctors were confused themselves, to be sure, about what their patients' options were now that abortion was banned. Next slide. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page about what their options actually are as of today, abortion access can be done by traveling to states where it's legal. It's still illegal in the majority of US states. If you've got the money, you can travel for legal abortion. We've yet to see laws that ban a citizen of one state from traveling to a jurisdiction in another state. There is also at this moment in time a lot of funding in abortion funds, both nationally and at the state level, that will help to offset the costs of that travel, transportation, housing, many people flying on airplanes for the first time, able to bring a loved one or a support person with them in order to get to a state where abortion is legal. But travel is hard and even impossible for some, for those who have childcare obligations, who have inflexible work hours, an unsupportive partner, for the youth, for folks living in rural areas. And so for them, telemedicine is an option. I've got legal in quotes here because there's some uncertainty about the practice of prescribing medicine out of state for a person in a state where abortion is legal, but there is ample opportunity for those who are sophisticated to use telemedicine to access legal abortion. And then there's the informal market, which is the market that I saw in Chile and in El Salvador, which allows folks to access abortificants. And if you look at the next slide, I've sort of sketched out, just for those of you who haven't dipped a toe into it, just the beginning of a list of some options for using self-managed abortion. It's safe, it's effective, it's easy to access. Anyone with a debit card and an address to mail the drugs to can access them. You're able to access both the combination of mifepristone and misoprostol, which we know of in this country as RU-486. You can access it online for less than $100. Misoprostol, which is used alone throughout the world today, and that was the drug that was available on the streets in Latin America, is around 92% effective. The efficacy, though, depends upon guidance. It depends on you having access to the information about how to determine what the drug is, how far along your pregnancy is, how to take it, how much to take, what to expect, when to seek emergency care, what to say if you seek emergency care, right? So again, here, the problem of accessing abortion in a place where it's banned is dependent as much on access to an abortion medicine as it is on abortion information. Next slide. So just to drive home the point about who needs this information, There was a survey last week from the Kaiser Family Foundation that showed that half of adults, can't believe I've been teaching on Zoom forever and still had that happen. Sorry. So there's widespread confusion about abortion options. Half of the population remains pretty confused about the process of using abortificants, and that doesn't even touch the questions of how to access the funding and the support for travel that I spoke of earlier. Okay, next slide. So abortion confusion is one example of a broader problem of health literacy, which is a problem that we woke up to in this country with COVID misinformation, but the world has been waking up to for the past few decades. Low health literacy is a problem that is devastating for individuals who struggle accessing health information. It's also a huge drain on society. It intensifies financial consequences for the individual and society, and it really intensifies social inequity. It's so important in this country that the US government's Healthy People 2030 goals are actually centering the problem of health literacy and the need to attain health literacy in order to improve the health and well-being of all. Health literacy, unfortunately, is not evenly distributed across the population. Next slide. So the reason why it's a problem in terms of abortion is that if we understand low health literacy as disproportionately impacting patients who are vulnerable for reasons of poverty, race, geography, and age, then we also have to understand that those who are most likely to struggle to identify accurate abortion information come from exactly the same segment of the population that is most likely to experience an unwanted pregnancy, and also exactly the same segment of the population that is disproportionately likely to seek abortion. This data prior to Dobbs shows that 75% of all US abortions went to people living below or just above the poverty line. Half of the abortions go to folks to the bottom 13% of the population in terms of income. Next slide. So this population, the sort of disproportionately poor American population, is also disproportionately Black and brown because US poverty is not colorblind. If poverty was equally distributed across race, we'd all be at the midline on this chart. And instead, at every age level, Black and Hispanic Americans are disproportionately likely to be poor. Next slide. So when we look at the profile of US abortion patients, the results are not surprising. Disproportionate rates of poverty drive disproportionate rates of abortion, which in our case today will drive disproportionately high need for support accessing accurate abortion information. Next slide. So the key question for us is what are the doctor's obligations in response to the challenge of low health literacy in the abortion context? And generally, the duty to provide health information has been folded into what we think of as standard of care or standard quality treatment for healthcare providers. Doctors must ensure that their patients have access to and comprehend the health information they need in order to make sound decisions consistent with the patient's values and well-being. In the abortion context, first of all, I think you've probably heard from other speakers in this series that that abortion care is health care, right? Abortion is a core component of comprehensive reproductive health care. We're so charged in this country by the political debate that we seem often to lose sight of the reality that abortion care is essential for preventing maternal mortality and morbidity. Not only is it a safe and effective treatment option, it's safer than childbirth. And as such, the leading US medical organizations, including the AMA, recognize induced abortion as an essential component of women's health care. What's interesting is that the same organizations are increasingly naming abortion information as central to abortion care, recognizing that without access to accurate information, patients face elevated risks of negative health outcomes, right? The negative risks that historically attached to legal abortion. The World Health Organization estimates that there are 39,000 deaths a year, along with millions of hospitalizations from unsafe abortions. Right. And in 2022, the World Health Organization listed the scarcity of access to accurate information first among abortion-related problems that jeopardize women's health because it leads them to use unsafe methods. Next slide. Our doctors in this state last summer already knew which patients would struggle to access accurate information. They already knew: poor, less educated, isolated patients. Next slide. What's interesting is that the same doctor who described so brutally and compassionately the patients who would struggle also agreed that, or told us that he would not be able to disclose that information, right? Not all of our doctors agreed with this position. Some insisted that they would continue to advise patients that abortion was legal in the states nearby, but they felt they were taking a risk in stating that fact, and that they had no institutional backing, and that they were pretty sure that they were alone among their colleagues in providing even this limited information. And I want to remind you here that their reluctance was not because of conscience. These were not conscientious objectors. These were doctors who were afraid. These were doctors whose hospital lawyers were setting practice parameters. It's my argument today that this response is not enough, that even just saying it's legal in a nearby state is not enough. It's an argument that grows out of what I believe to be a doctor's ethical obligation to inform their patients so that they can make informed choices about their options. Next slide. So there are a bunch of justifications for finding that doctors are required to disclose abortion information. One of the more interesting ones grows out of a decision that from Ireland in 1992. The Irish government had attempted to restrict abortion information by forbidding doctors or counselors from telling patients how to take a plane across the channel to England in order to end their pregnancies. And the challenge that was brought found that the Irish government could not censor people from informing other people about lawful abortion services available elsewhere. They found that such censorship violated the individual's freedom to access and receive information pertinent to the human right to health. We don't seem to have a human rights discourse. Maybe we don't really have human rights in this country. So I'm not pinning my hat here, or my hopes here on a human rights argument. One might also, though, raise a harm reduction argument that the reason why you must disclose this is to reduce the harm of non-disclosure. Instead, I'm going to be speaking about what I think are basic medical ethics grounds and professional norms that inform the obligation to share abortion information. Next slide. So I'm going to move through this fairly quickly because I'm going to assume some background familiarity with the Beecham and Childress 4 principles of medical ethics. Bears noting that autonomy, basic access to abortion information is central to the clinician's ethical obligation, and obviously abortion information is vital to the patient's ability to chart their own life course. Beneficence, given the negative health outcomes associated with low health literacy, beneficence would justify, as would non-maleficence, a policy that demands disclosure. Justice, low health literacy is costly for the individual, for her family, and for the population as a whole. Any one of these core ethical principles would suffice to establish the ethical obligation to provide patients with abortion information. That I can actually spend pages on each of them simply underscores the fact that regardless of their personal beliefs about the morality of abortion, clinicians have an ethical obligation to inform their patient about treatment options. Next slide. So if good, sound medical practice requires sharing abortion information, then remaining silent violates good medical practice. In short, I would argue that it's malpractice to stay silent. I also believe that the integrity of the medical profession depends upon the primacy of the doctor-patient relationship. There is a slippery slope for doctors once the state is permitted to impinge upon that relationship. Next slide. By way of sort of explaining what I mean by slippery slope, in an era of self-managed abortion, a state that's inclined to enforce abortion bans must use the emergency room as a crime scene investigation. Right? It's law enforcement that will need the doctors to notify police when they suspect their patients intentionally ended a pregnancy. When doctors call police, they violate confidentiality, the most sacred of duties. It's also bad policy to have patients be worried about seeking life-threatening care, because they're afraid that their doctors will report them. But some doctors comply. Right? In El Salvador, half of the cases that are investigated for abortion originate in calls from the healthcare setting. Just weeks into Texas's abortion ban last fall, we saw evidence of this pattern when a doctor called police after his hemorrhaging patient told him she had taken abortion pills. According to Pregnancy Justice, an organization that provides legal defense in such cases, more than 1,600 women have been prosecuted since '73. Of those prosecutions, 1,200 of them occurred in the past 15 years. And of those, the overwhelming majority involve poor and disproportionately poor Black pregnant women. 59% in there, they have this one study from '73 to 2005, 59% were women of color, 52% of those prosecuted identified as Black. Next slide. It's clear to me, at least, that doctors have an ethical and a professional obligation to provide abortion information, but it's also clear to me as a professor of criminal law and health law that doing so is risky. They are right to be afraid. There's a risk of accomplice liability, which I think is the sort of the biggest risk in terms of criminal prosecution. Those of you who've taken first-year criminal law will remember that an accomplice is somebody who doesn't do the criminal act themselves, but who does something to encourage or aid or assist in a material manner the commission of a crime. There's variations at the state law level. Every state has its own version of accomplice liability, but the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the clinician at least knew the patient intended to break the law, right? In the majority of states, they actually have to show that the doctor intended for the patient to break the law, which I think would be a harder burden. The prosecution must also prove that providing abortion information constitutes material assistance here, right? I think that this is actually, practically speaking, a relatively low risk. In other words, it's a high bar for the prosecution to show that in providing information, which many folks understand simply by being able to get online, was in fact material assistance, or that the doctor in fact absolutely knew that the patient intended to have an illegal abortion. But my thinking that is slim comfort for the doctor who is worried about their livelihood, their reputation, their job. Practically speaking, I also think the risk of prosecution will turn on a given community's appetite for prosecuting doctors. DAs are typically elected officials, and the question that they, I think, will be weighing is whether the public will support an effort to muzzle the medical profession. Right? There's also a risk of civil consequences. The civil liability risk is a slightly lower bar, I think, for plaintiffs. The risk of civil liability for doctors is potentially ruinous in states that have bounty laws like Texas. One of our doctors said to us, look, she tells her neighbor, and the next door neighbor then makes sure that I'm on the hook for them. Right? The bounty laws as of yet have not generated much litigation, but by incentivizing private citizens to bring civil lawsuits against anyone suspected of aiding or abetting a prohibited abortion, there's every reason to believe we'll see them, right? Texas functionally shut down abortion without any lawsuits actually being filed. Like the fear of civil liability was sufficiently grave. I think the biggest risk is actually professional harm, though. If your hospital forbids you from sharing abortion information with patients, you might be fired for doing so. If your hospital refuses to back you in the event of a prosecution or a lawsuit, you risk financial ruin from legal fees and fallout from reputational damage, even if you win. In a state that has an activist conservative medical licensing board, sharing abortion information might jeopardize your license to practice medicine, might make you unable to get malpractice insurance. In short, sharing basic abortion information could jeopardize your career and your livelihood. It's really hard to predict the likelihood of any of these risks materializing. Might a doctor actually lose their job for providing abortion information consistent with, indeed demanded by, sound medical, ethical, and professional practice? Next slide. So I want to sort of start with a public service announcement in response to my rhetorical question, which is that professional organizations could actually manage and really reduce these risks by telling doctors they must share abortion information, by making it clear what the standard of care is. They could really reduce the risk to individual clinicians. There is, as I said earlier, I think an existential threat to the medical profession if state lawmakers dictate the standard of care. The profession itself, by declaring what the standard of care is, keeps the lines clear. It also makes it much easier to defend doctors, right? The doctor will then have a defense in the event of a lawsuit or a prosecution by saying, look, in order to keep my license, in order to be an ethical provider, I had to comply with the standard of care here. It also makes it harder for the prosecution. It makes it very clear that they're trying to muzzle doctors who are doing what they are ethically obligated to do. It makes it plain that the strategy of the prosecution in a case like this would be to trick the most vulnerable population into falsely believing that they have no choice but to carry an unwanted pregnancy to term. But instead, they're ducking. Next slide. This is just one example of what we're getting out of the organizations at this stage of the game. The American Academy of Pediatrics was quick to declare how important information, accurate, trustworthy abortion information was. But then in the very next breath, they invite doctors to pick. They can choose to be unethical and be silent and still call themselves ethical. Right? By the way, no state law says that it's illegal to provide accurate abortion information at this point in time. And yet this language from the American Academy of Pediatrics invites doctors to pull back from that standard of care. Next slide. So, it strikes me that it's worth considering the hierarchy of those placed at risk by abortion bans. There's the profession itself. There's the individual clinicians, and there are the patients. A profession that fails to set boundaries around ethical practice and to call out members who violate their ethical duties likewise forces individual clinicians to bear the risks of following those duties. Right? In turn, a doctor who stays silent forces the patient, the most vulnerable of those parties, to bear the risks of harm from abortion bans. Next slide. So to recap here, clinician silence will disproportionately harm their most vulnerable patient, right? The most vulnerable patients are, and this, I think is widely established by the doctors that we talk to, as well as widely understood nationally, are those who are disproportionately poor people of color. They are at risk of all of the negative health outcomes that come with not having access to good, solid, trustworthy abortion information. We know that they will attempt later, riskier methods. We know that they'll experience higher rates of medical complications. We know that when they show up in the healthcare setting or elsewhere, they're at heightened risk of prosecution. We also understand that they're going to bear a higher likelihood of forced pregnancy, which, along with the mental health consequences, and for the overwhelming majority, because adoption has never been more than an outlier response, the life-altering consequences of child rearing. And the consequence that weighs most heavily front and center for me these days grows out of the phenomena of the medicalization of poverty. Because we know these folks that are going to struggle to access accurate information are disproportionately poor, their children will be born into poverty, which the same American Academy of Pediatrics tells us has lifelong consequences. Children who experience poverty, particularly during early life, are at risk for a host of adverse health and developmental outcomes, lifelong hardship, poor developmental and physical and psychosocial outcomes, significant financial burden, lower school readiness, lower academic achievement, lower job placement levels, lower life expectancy. And the consequences are not just borne by the children and their families, but in fact by the rest of society. Next slide. So at least in the short run, there is no real, I think, chance for avoiding the collision between the legal risks and the ethical obligations. A clinician's silence necessarily undermines their core values that animate the doctor-patient relationship and necessarily undermines the integrity of the medical profession as a whole. To be silent permits the state to conscript doctors in the effort to weaponize educational, economic, and health disparities so as to lead those with less access to information to incorrectly conclude they have no option but to continue an unwanted pregnancy. All right, that was a lot of information, and I'm sure I talked too quickly, but I'm finished with my slides and I'm happy to answer questions.
Oh.
Lisa, that's you.
Yeah, I was on mute. Yeah, see, so that's up there with you and the telephone. You'd think I'd learn. I just wanted to thank you for that amazing talk. And I'm going to turn to the questions in the chat and invite the audience to put their questions in the chat. But I'm going to invite Diane to ask her question first, if you want to go ahead. Or do you want me to?
Although actually, I'm happy to have people in the audience who are raising their hand also.
All right. If you raise your hand, sure. So Dina.
Hi there, Michelle. This is terrific. So I can't remember the name of the case off the bat, but in Florida a while back, if you remember, the state had passed a law that banned pediatricians from asking families about whether there were guns in the home. And that was overturned on First Amendment grounds, if I remember rightly. Why would that not be a way to go?
So to ban doctors from talking about it, like if you had, like this state that I'm working in, I imagine they would gladly pass a law like that. So your question is why, and maybe it would go the route of, well, you can't do that under First Amendment.
Okay.
What's interesting to me is that the chilling effect is so profound that the state hasn't had to do that. Right. I mean, the state didn't do anything other than ban it to get these doctors running for the corners of the rooms. I'm so sorry. You should go online, you who don't have access to decent Wi-Fi. Right. They didn't even have to do it.
Perverse people in the world. I don't know whether it's all the money they put in their medical education or what, but doctors are scaredy cats. What can I say?
Well, they are, but again, to a fault, I tend to fall in love with the people that I'm interviewing. And so I understood their fear. And I just felt like, okay, who could have their backs right now? And it's the institutions. Like, what would it take for the American Academy of Pediatrics to say, I am so sorry, but you have to provide this?
Jamila? Dr.
Hi.
Jamila.
Yes, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I'm Dr. Jamila Parrott. I'm one of those doctors.
I know your work. I'm so happy to meet you.
It's wonderful to meet you too. I'm an abortion provider and I lead an organization called Physicians for Reproductive Health that does advocacy work around comprehensive care for the communities we serve. I have so many questions, but I'm not going to take up a lot of time. I would love to hear you talk, if you wouldn't mind, about how we grapple with the conflation of legality and safety in this country in particular, right? As we're thinking about, we see that oftentimes in our patients who think because something is illegal, it must be unsafe. Knowing the history of abortion advocacy and legality in this country, we know that those things are not connected any longer, given the fact that we have access to alternative routes for providing abortion care. So I would love to hear you speak about that. And then I would be remiss if I didn't comment on the fear that folks feel for around that abortion providers are holding, that doctors are holding. And I want to say that since 1973 and before, abortion providers have been at the front of this fight and have been screaming from the roofs that everybody else should be paying attention. I'm seeing patients tomorrow. I will walk through 30 protesters to be able to get in to provide the care for the people that I need. That isn't fear-based behavior. But the ask for us in this moment is to go further and to put even more on the line for ourselves in terms of our personal risk. I want us to understand that in the context of the risk we are already taking to provide this care. So for the folks that the American Academy of Pediatricians or other providers who are looking at this but have not historically provided abortion care, I think there is a lot of work to do, but we have to honor and recognize the work that has been happening under violent, harmful, dangerous, oppressive circumstances since 1973.
Yeah, I'm so glad you flagged that. Among the more sort of poignant moments in my interviews were doctors who had been sort of the go-to from the folks that were in hospitals with restrictive practices. And so the phone would be like, okay, I've got this patient, we're sending her over in her own car against medical advice, and you'll take care of it, right? And there was a certain amount of like, no, like I can't take care of it. Don't you understand? You got us here, right? Like that sort of frustration. And at some level, it's like, welcome to my party. This is, I've been doing this for so long and I can't do it anymore. To your first question, though, how do we untangle illegal from unsafe? My answer to it comes out of what I saw working in El Salvador and what worries me here, which is that what untangled it there was having a network of trusted lay people that then just, really, if you've got the information or you know who to go to for the information, then it just stops seeming dangerous. Think marijuana. Right? It just didn't seem dangerous, even though the government was telling us it was dangerous. And it took a while to get to the point where we'd be like, oh, okay, everybody knows this is not the same as just say meth or whatever. But I hope we can get there more quickly. I think that what I watched over the 10 years that I was doing my work in El Salvador was a slow rolling out where the information about how to do this safely was held in pockets, not necessarily pockets of super educated people. In El Salvador, as in Brazil, actually, it was, sort of a need to know local lore, and here's how you do it. So I have faith in the people, like that's going to shift it, but it surely would help if we had the profession saying, this is self-managed abortion, here's where you go for a really trustworthy site, right? And like the thing I ducked away from in my talk is like, well, what information do they have to provide? At the very least, I think they should say, here is where it's legal, and here's at least one place you can go to. And I think I Need an Abortion is a really great website in terms of access. There's a bunch of them out there, but I feel like if you can find somebody who can get you to that website, then you'll be able to navigate your way through. But there are other options. The problem is the same problem we saw with COVID and health illiteracy. If you're in an information silo, it's very hard to navigate through all of the stuff that comes up when you plug in, and then that battle for sort of which things come up first. That battle is hard fought at this stage.
For sure. Can I say one thing? I know other folks have questions. Just to offer that in addition to that, the information desert that folks are experiencing and their ability to access these websites, there's also a deep concern that we're holding around the risk of criminalization. For the people that you mentioned who have been criminalized, their data has been collected and weaponized against them in these cases. It is Google searches. It is sort of accessing mail services overseas. And so this communication of information for by healthcare providers to people seeking abortion care has to be framed within the understanding that those at greatest risk for not being able to access clinic-based abortion are also those at greatest risk for being criminalized by the criminal legal system. And so teaching people how to keep safe while accessing this care that is criminalized is going to be critical. Thank you so much for all you're doing. I have such deep gratitude and love for your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Karen.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. And it's inspiring. I have so many questions, but I'll limit it to one and then a comment. We're spending a lot of time bad mouthing doctors who are appearing to be not having backbone. And I think there are a lot of lawyers on this Zoom, and a lot of these doctors are hearing from lawyers in the institutions that they work in not to do X, Y, and Z. Wait till the person bleeds almost to death before you can do things. And a very conservative view, or maybe not conservative, I don't know what you would call it, but a narrow view, I think, in terms of what is the risk of liability and criminalization in those states, et cetera, in terms of even then providing any sort of informed consent. So what's your sense of that nationwide? What recommendations do you have in which this lawyer group could actually do something to try to change that dialogue?
I love that you asked it, because it's actually on my mind in a bunch of different contexts these days, not just in the narrow context of abortion information. It's really clear that lawyers put a primacy on making sure that their organization stays safe. So what we've seen is a pulling back because you feel like, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run my abortion fund, or I'm going to run my Planned Parenthood in a way that actually best keeps it in business, which is very different from, and at times at odds with, in the way that best serves my clients. Right. And so a lot of what I heard on the ground there was, well, the lawyers, the hospital counsel, and a little bit of frustration, and over time, a lot of frustration. I can't do what I need to do because I have to run it by the hospital counsel. And the hospital counsel is not out there saying my job is to protect patients' well-being, or even my job is to permit you to do what you're ethically obligated to do. It's my job is to make sure that my institution doesn't get sued. So, yeah, I mean, it's like one of those, first we kill all the lawyers, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Diane.
Yeah, so I had also had a question along those lines, but I did want to go back to the issue of First Amendment, and also mention Conant versus Walters when you mentioned medical marijuana, because that was, the federal government was prohibiting physicians to inform patients about the availability of medical marijuana, and that was struck down. So I would think that that would be good precedent. I mean, it's a Ninth Circuit case for this kind of argument with respect to what physicians can say to patients. And the other thing I was just wondering if you thought about whether you think the state medical boards, I mean, if you're talking about medical ethics of professional obligations, may have a role, and whether it's worthwhile to kind of work with the Federation of State Medical Boards.
it's a great idea.
Like
Thank you.
I actually just want to jump in to follow on what Diane was saying. In sort of in your presentation, you're talking about both the sort of the professional ethics, but also professional norms. And I think professional norms, right, that's kind of can mean a lot of different things. And I wanted to maybe encourage you to sort of maybe think now, but also in the paper, about starting with the professional organizations, right? That maybe a lot of the work needs to be done there. There's a decreasing autonomy among physician practices, right? There's a lot of constraints on what they can do already. There's a lot of sort of control being taken away. And there's also this concern that if you put too much risk on physicians, that we're not going to have any physicians left, right? That there's too much focus on them as the ones who need to provide this information. And so I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about when you're thinking about professional norms, what were you thinking about? And maybe maybe shifting the emphasis to start with the sort of the call for duty there, which you call them to duty, but but starting with them.
Yeah, it's funny. Like, I think it only came into view for me after I had sifted through all of the ethical obligations. Because honestly, sitting in conversation with doctors, like when you witness them, they weren't saying, I think I'm committing malpractice, or I feel like I'm constrained in my role as a doctor. Instead, they were saying, this just feels wrong. I feel like I'm not able to take care of my patients. And so my focus on ethics grew out of those intimate and painful conversations. And only later did was I like, wait, this is both malpractice and literally much more readily fixed if the profession itself polices the boundaries, right? So yeah, this is an interesting suggestion, and I'll play with it. Thanks.
We have a few minutes left. There was a question in the chat asking if you could talk about the intersection of EMTALA and the laws and states that prohibit abortion services. That was from Natalie McCherry.
Yeah, so for those on the call that are curious about what EMTALA is, EMTLA, so I'm going to try to answer this succinctly. So there's laws that require that when you have a patient show up in your hospital with an emergency, you have to stabilize them before transferring them. And the emergency room is a really intense locus for cases around pregnancy loss, because the dominant side effect of a medication abortion, if you're self-managing, is hemorrhage. So people show up in emergency rooms bleeding all the time. It's, emergency room doctors have been encountering this for years. They know how to stop it. What's come into view since Dobbs is the risk that when you show up, if you tell your doctor why you are hemorrhaging, that you were pregnant and that you're no longer pregnant and that you took medicine, the question is, what does the doctor do with that information? Do you, how do you communicate to the patient that maybe they oughtn't to tell their doctor this? And then the messiness of when you're hemorrhaging, knowing which hospital might be a safer emergency room to go to. I mean, like I told you I was going to talk quickly. It's a hot mess, right? And in fact, the most disturbing conversations that I had there were emergency room doctors that weren't ready for it, that didn't have like here's how we lock down the emergency room setting so that nobody is calling the cops, right? They didn't understand that anybody in that room might well call the cops. And of course, what you want as a doctor is to promise confidentiality so that you can best treat them. And we as a profession epidemiologically should want to know, oh, there's like some bad miso out there, or there's people that are actually not getting reliable information. So we'd want to be able to, as a profession, both know that it's happening, know best practices for how to respond to it, and ensure patients that they can come, that they don't have to bleed out on the floor of their living room, right? So I think that's the intersection. And I think that it's unfortunately an intersection with a lot of collisions happening.
Yeah, I was thinking actually, I'm the one who asked the question of a different intersection and collision, and that is when the stabilizing emergency medical care that is required for someone that has to be provided by a hospital under EMTALA, or they're in violation of that, when that care is in fact an abortion, and they're in a state that doesn't allow abortions. What in the world are they supposed to do? Now we have a conflict between federal and state law. What are they supposed to do?
Oh, right. Yeah. So the good news is that there are a lot of lawyers smarter than I am that are working on that, on resolving that sort of conflict. And honestly, it feels to me like it is a conflict that's more readily resolved, right? Like you'll
Okay.
get, clear lines. There need to be clear lines on this. We know what procedures are and aren't. I mean, I watched it happening in real time, like stories about miscarriage, mismanagement, and ectopics. Then over the course of literally the 3 weeks that I was there, like, okay, ectopics are fine, right? So the concern for me, the reason why I went into that long soliloquy about confidentiality, the concern is much more the nurse in the room picking up the phone, right? And then the tax being placed on seeking life-saving care. Yeah.
I think we're out of time, so I wanted to give my warmest thanks to Professor Oberman for this amazing talk, and also for the work that you're doing. I think we're all deeply appreciative, but thank you very much for this great conversation.
Thank you. And I'm sincere when I say I really would love comments. So don't hesitate to email. Really, just find me and let me know what you're thinking.
And let me just add from the Law and Healthcare Program, our thanks and gratitude again, Michelle, for your wonderful work and your presentation. It was fabulous. And to everyone else who participated and attended and asked great questions, thank you. I also did want to let you know about our two of our upcoming events, including our 2023 Rome lecture, which will be given by Professor Leslie Wolf from Georgia State University School of Law, I believe on March 20th. And the title of her talk is Implementing Justice in Research. And then the fourth in our Rothenberg speaker series, which will be on April 20th and be given by Amit Sarpachwari from Harvard Medical School, who will be talking about federal preemption in the area of access to medication abortion. So a good follow-up to Professor Oberman's presentation. So I hope we'll see you all at one of those, if not both. And again, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Michelle, for a great talk.
Thank you.